Hello, this is Gray Lovelace with Technically Speaking at SourceAllies. Today we're going to be talking about some really cool stuff with dev containers. So not specifically talking about writing code, but more the environment in which we write our code and how we can make that more consistent, how we can make it, just the same for everybody, which is really nice, and even get around specific problems that you might have with your particular setup, which is my case that I'm going to show you. So let's dive into dev containers. Let's talk a little bit about why. So one, ease of use. I have use of use here, so we're just going to change that to ease of use. So ease of use, really, you can launch into a project, and if that project has a dev container set up, you can just immediately hit the ground running. You can start contributing day one. You don't have to spend a day or two or a few hours trying to get your environment set up the right way to be able to get your app running. A good dev container setup should be able to launch, install what it needs to the first time, and then you're good to go. And you can run the application, run the tests, and start contributing right away. Here's one that we're going to be focusing a lot on today, which is disparate developer environments. So for my personal machine, I use a Linux distribution called NixOS. And NixOS is great. It does a lot of declarative framework stuff. However, one thing it's really not great at is interacting with certain languages and certain workloads on those languages. Today, we are specifically going to be talking about Python and different workloads, Jupyter notebooks, and some other things that running those Python workloads in NixOS is a pain. And there are a few different workarounds you can try and a few I've tried, but dev containers has really been the saving grace that actually, sets up stuff for other people well too. Bespoke server and application setups. I worked with a client one time that had a legacy application that when it ran in its server, it needed certain files to exist in certain directories, and it needed certain permissions to be set up on those. And really getting your developer set up to be able to run the application locally was a pain. And it took people weeks. And in fact, a lot of the people that we worked with just never even did it because it was such a hassle. So one of the first things we did was set up a Docker container and a dev container to say, hey, as soon as you open this project, you can now run it immediately and you don't need to worry about all that stuff. And the other really nice thing is it's not some documentation file that's going to get out of sync. It is something that actually controls whether or not something works. So it's codified to work every time. And if it doesn't work, it's now a problem that people can go address and check into version control. And then really, just the last couple are things that go along with those other ones. So things like troubleshooting. I've worked with different people before where they say, hey, this thing doesn't work, or it works on my machine. We've all heard that before. What's nice is if you say, okay, well, if you run it in the dev container, does it work? Because then everyone's working from the exact same baseline. And if it does work there, but it doesn't work on your machine, great. Now we have a delta that we can look between and try and figure out where that issue is. Or you can just use the dev container. And then needed extensions. This can be a whole host of different things. One that I run into a lot is we do a lot of diagramming. I make a bunch of architecture diagrams, and often I will do those in something like draw.io. And there's a built-in draw.io extension for VS Code that, if you have it, allows you to view and edit those diagrams directly in the Git repo and check them in and out of source control without having to work with their web app. And that's a really nice thing to be able to just put in the dev container, and people don't even need to know about it. As soon as they launch that dev container, they can click the file and it already shows them what they're looking for. So a whole host of different reasons you might want to use this, but let's dive into what it actually looks like. So how would I even set up a dev container? Let's kind of set the scene here. So in my case, like I said, I'm trying to work in Python. NixOS and Python don't really get along super well. So I'm going to show you, I typically use a package manager called UV. You can see that UV is installed here. You can do the same thing with Poetry or Conda or a whole host of different things. But here we're going to use UV. And for UV, I can say UV init, and it'll make me a new project. So if I go refresh this, we see we have all this. It's a Git repository. It has a PyProject toml for me that I can look at. Excellent. And then if I come down here and I say UV sync, it will actually go download everything that it needs, and it will create my virtual environment for me, which you see right here. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. And in fact, if I looked at my main.py, I could even run this. So if I say UV run main.py, we see that hello from Technically Speaking dev containers. We're in great shape. All right, so now let's do the harder thing. So the harder thing in this case is I am going to try and work within a Jupyter notebook because I have to do that from time to time. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to say main.ipynb. As you can see, I got rid of my normal Python main script that I had before, and this opens up in the Jupyter Notebooks view here. Perfect. So now I want to write some code, and let's just do a simple print, hello world. Excellent. So, as you can see, doesn't look great right now. If I go hit run, we're going to be presented with the, hey, select what Python environment or Python kernel that you're going to write this under. So if I go to Python environments, I should see that virtual environment that UV created for me. Excellent. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to click that. Then I'm going to hit play or execute, and it doesn't work. So this is really tiny down here, but what it says is that if you want to run cells in a Python notebook, you need a kernel that has pip, notebook, and the Jupyter package installed. Okay, fine, we can do that. I could install here. That's not going to work either. Yeah, cancel. It doesn't like it. It has a bad time. It even says something about just being unable to install those things. So if I go to UV and I say, hey, UV, I want you to install pip and notebook and Jupyter, stuff like that. Yeah, Jupyter. So great. It installs those for me. If I go look at my PyProject toml, I can see them there. They're good to go. And then if I go back here and I hit execute, hey, look, it still doesn't work. It requires the kernel spec package. Okay, let's do that as well. So I will say UV add kernel spec. Okay, it doesn't love that. That's fine too. Either way, it's going to tell me it needs things. It's never going to actually work. Spoilers. But because it doesn't work, I know this is tied to me being on a NixOS system. So how can I get around this? How can I actually work in the same environment as other people without all this bespoke configuration on my side? That's where I would start leveraging something like dev containers. So if we wanted to do that, we don't even need to change any of the stuff that we've already made. We just come here, I'm going to open up my command palette, and I'm just going to say dev container, rebuild and reopen in container. And it knows I don't have a dev container set up, so I'm going to add one to the workspace so everyone else can leverage this as well. And you can see that it's going to give me a bunch of different options. In our case, we are running this on Python 3.14. So I'm going to say Python 3. And then I'm going to say 3.14 Trixie. You can use Bookworm. You can use whatever you want. Not a big deal. And then there's an option to add on features from this point. We're going to dive into those in a second. We're not going to look at them right now. Let's keep things really simple. So I'm just going to say, okay, we're good to go. We're not going to add Dependapot in this case, and it's going to make my dev container for me. So the first time this happens, it's going to need to pull down some things and set some things up. Shouldn't take too long, but you should be good to go pretty quickly, and it won't need to do that again unless you change something really substantially on the way your dev container is configured. So we can see now that I am running inside my dev container in the bottom left here, which is a great visual indicator. We can see that we've made a .dev container and a dev container.json right here. And there's a lot of nice comments in here, but in reality, all this really boils down to is I gave my dev container a name, which can be whatever we want it to be, and it is using a base Docker image. You can even make custom Docker images and have them build them dynamically and use them here. In this case, we're just going to use one of the base images they provide, which is Python 3.14 Trixie. So if I wanted to go do stuff, I might run into some blockers now. So before, do you remember how we were using UV to do all of our package management? Well, UV doesn't exist anymore. So let's start digging into some of the things that you can do once you've created a dev container to run on. We do have Python, however, which is really nice. So the first thing I want to do is I want to install UV and make sure that I can use it with my project. So there are a few different ways to do that. I'm going to show you the more flexible way first, then I'm going to show you probably the more robust way after that. So the first way that we're going to do it is we are going to leverage what are called post-create commands. So as soon as your thing comes up, you can start taking it and doing different things to it. So we are going to take UV's install script and just throw it in that post create command to make sure that we have UV inside of our container. So you can see here in the docs for installing UV, I can go grab this curl that pipes it to the sh command. I can go back here and there is a post create command that I can uncomment and just replace with our new information. And I'm just going to add a comment or a comma, and then I'm going to rebuild. So you can even see that sometimes when you make changes, it just prompts you to rebuild. If not, you can go into the command palette and rebuild from there pretty easily. So you can see it came up right away. We can actually see that UV script installing, saying everything's installed, and we're good to go. So if I hit OK, now if I run the UV command, you can see that it's there and ready. Perfect. We don't have to worry about installing it on everyone's individual machine. It's just ready and good to go. So now that we have this here, can we build the app? Let's say UV sync again. Excellent. Everything syncs for us. We're in good shape. Now let's go run our Python notebook and try and execute it. Oh, and we have a problem. So do you see where it says install enable suggested extensions? So in my personal setup for VS Code outside of Dev Container, I have the Jupyter Notebook extension and extension library installed, which allows me to use this notebook format pretty easily. If I don't have that configured in my Dev Container JSON, it's not going to be there. And if we want someone working in this project with us, we want them all to have this extension because that's the way something our code needs to execute properly. So let's go add it to our Dev Container setup. So here we are going to add a couple of different things, and this is going to be more specific per tool that you're using, per IDE that you're using. I'm using VS Code in this case, so the nice thing about the Dev Container spec is it supports multiple IDEs. So in our case, we're just going to go to customizations, say, hey, only for the VS Code IDE, I want you to do this. I want you to add these extensions by default. So now if I hit rebuild, it should add those extensions for me already, download them, put them on the virtual environment there, and now I should be able to go into my notebook, hit run, and it'll actually allow me to choose a kernel this time. It's still initializing, give it a couple seconds here, and now we're presented with the menu that we're used to. So I go to Python environments, I pick our virtual environment that's right here, and we are finally in a working state where we can run hello world, and it can greet the world. Great. So that helps me personally get around a lot of issues that I have with my personal setup and being able to develop in Python, in Jupyter Notebooks, and really there are quite a few different workloads that it struggles with that this helps me get around. But there are a lot of other features that we can leverage as well. Let's say instead of working in a Jupyter Notebook, you are trying to create a server of some kind. What are some things that might be helpful there? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a quick server that just does hello world for us. I am going to open up my terminal and show you that if I run localhost hello, I failed to connect, there's nothing there. Great. So this is where Dev Container networking will come in handy. There's a ports menu that you may not have ever even looked at VS Code before. That's totally fine. We're going to leverage this quite a bit. So I'm going to make a new file here, and we're just going to call it server.py. And this server.py, we're going to leverage Fast API. So I'm going to go back here, do a UV add. I'm going to say Fast API and Uvicorn, which is the server it runs on. Excellent, those are installed. And now I can take a little bit of code that I have, and we're just going to make a Fast API app, make a /hello endpoint, and then run it on port 8000. It should be pretty simple here. So here I'm just going to say UV run server. We can see that our server started up, and more importantly, we can see that our ports has a little 1 here now. So this doesn't always happen. I'll show you how you can make this a little bit more specific if you want to. But typically, VS Code will listen for different ports starting up, whether that be through something like Docker Compose or just normal Docker, or if you're running an application through your environment. And it'll say, hey, I need to forward that port dynamically. So if I go to ports, I can see that my app is running on localhost 8000. Excellent. And so if I go to my main machine, so this is not running in the Dev Container, and I try and ping it, I do get hello world back. Excellent. That's exactly what we're looking for. However, if it didn't auto forward this for me and I got rid of it, if I go try and run this now, it's going to fail again. Okay, let's assume that it's not picking that up for some reason. How would I set up ports being auto-forwarded always? Because we know what ports our app is going to be running on when we're doing development for it. Let's go back to our Dev Container, and then we have forward ports here. That should be pretty simple. So I'm going to reach into my snippets that I already have and grab what this should look like. So if I want to forward my ports, I can forward my ports and then also add even more information to them. So I think it cached some things from earlier, which is why you saw a app name if you saw that earlier. But here is where you would configure something like that. So we're going to say forward our 8000 port, and then our 8000 port has some particular attributes like a label of my custom app, and we are going to say my custom app 2 because let's just make sure that it's actually working the way we want it to. Great. So I will do that. I will add a comma. and then we are going to rebuild. You notice this time it didn't prompt me for a rebuild, so I'll just open my palette and I'll say rebuild, and we'll just rebuild container. Excellent. You can see it doing that UV initialization again. And now, if I go to my ports, even though our app isn't currently running yet, we have already allocated for forwarding that port. And we can see that it's named custom app 2 just to have a nice human readable name available there. And then if I do go back to my terminal and I say UV run server, it works appropriately. We can see it being served there, and I can go back to my console, run my curl again, and we get the result that we want. Great. So, lots of different things you can do here. Let's dive into a couple of the more advanced features. So the last one I want to touch on inside the dev container itself is we did this post create command to install UV, but you might look at that and say, hey, this is probably a solved problem already. I don't think that we need to bespoke install UV every single time that we start our app, and you would be correct. So there's a whole ecosystem around dev containers called features. And so if I bring up my browser again here, we can look at what some of those features look like. So containers.dev/features, and then in here we can search for a lot of different things. You can see there are quite a few of them available. And so this should be for layering on functionality that you need beyond your base level Docker file that you have, or your base level Docker image that you're leveraging. In our case, our Docker image is Python 3.14, and we just really want to add UV to that. So if I'm going to go here, I'm going to search UV. There are a few different options. I'm going to opt for this dev containers extra one. So I'm going to copy that and then go back to our code and go to features right here. So for features, it will give you a list of different things, and I am just going to give it that feature that we copied the name of or the ID of, and then this is actually a dictionary or a map of different things. So you'll have the feature, and then you can give it different configurations depending on what it supports. This one doesn't support a lot. I think it does just support version, and it's always going to be latest, so we don't need to configure it with anything. So great, let's do that, and then let's come down here and comment out our post create command, so we're not doing that anymore, and let's rebuild. So anytime you're messing with features or you're messing with the base Docker image that you're using, it can take a little while, but again, it's really just going to be the first time that you do it because it needs to download the images and then kind of integrate them together if you're layering on features. After that first time, it really doesn't take almost any time to set up at all. In our case, I've done this before, so all of this stuff is kind of cached on my machine, and it works pretty seamlessly. So now that our post create command is done, we didn't see it installing like we have in the past when we were using our post create command, but do I still have UV? I do. Excellent. So I can use UV to do all of the different things that we did before, and it just does some kind of batteries included setup for us, which is really nice. There are lots of different things you can do here. I often will go in and add things like the AWS CLI. So if I type AWS here, it does nothing for me. However, if I went back to our dev container features and I looked for AWS, there's an AWS CLI that's kind of native to dev containers that I could use to do all of my AWS commands, which is great, especially as you're trying to install some of those command line tools on machines that are sometimes a little bit more locked down. Virtualization can be your friend. That is a light overview. There's a lot of different things that these dev containers can do that have built-in, built-in features. Features is a specific word, but other features and functionality that they provide. We talked through a few of these things, but really the unlock for me, like I said, is that personalization layer. And I want to dive into that for a second because it's really exciting. So my main problem when I started using dev containers is that I would miss certain things about my specific setup when I went in to use these dev containers. I would say things like, man, I really want to use that dev container. However, if I go look at my PyProject toml, this is not formatted at all. It doesn't have any syntax highlighting. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to take this extension that like does toml highlighting that's not necessary and then kind of force everyone else in my group that's working on this app to use it by putting it in the workspace's dev container JSON. So there's a pattern for that, which is nice. What you can do is you can layer on user level settings on top of the workspace level settings. Very similar to normal VS Code settings that you have, but working in this virtualized environment now. So let's take that exact example that I just talked about before. I can't stand this PyProject toml being all white with no syntax highlighting. Great, there's an extension for that. I think it's called Better Toml. I have an ID over here that I can grab. And so what I can do is I can go to my personal settings. So if I say settings, oops, I'm going to go to my user settings here. I'm just going to open the JSON version. And if I look all the way down at the bottom, I have commented out a couple of things. So we're going to uncomment those. So here, there is a value called dev.containers.default extensions. And default extensions is basically going to load the normal dev container JSON, install all of its extensions and everything it needs to, and then go in and additionally install whatever extensions you would like it to install that will only be on your instances of the dev container, not everybody else's. So in this case, we're going to use Even Better Toml, and let's just save that and then rebuild our app or rebuild our container and see if we start getting syntax highlighting on our PyProject toml. Excellent. Looks like we're in good shape. And now if I open my PyProject toml, great. I have syntax highlighting. Excellent. That's everything I want. I use this for all sorts of things. I have some like bracket colorizers. I have just these nice quality of life extensions that aren't necessary, and they're really more user specific than they are application specific or workspace or repository specific. It's really, really great for those. The last thing that really helped me as I was doing this is I started to miss some other things, specifically different things I had set up in the terminal that I thought were really helpful. So if we go back to my native terminal, that is not the one inside my dev container, you can see that I have some oh my posh. So that's where this little decorations up top is that tells me things like what user it is, what system it is, what path I'm on, if I'm in a GitHub environment or if I'm in a Git repository, tells me what branch I'm on, how far away from the head branch I am, as well as some information about Python, Java, and NPM or Node environments that I might be currently in for the directory that I have open. And I find that really, really nice. But when I go over to here, you can see that I don't have that anymore. It just says VS Code. It gives me my place. It does give me some of that information I want, but not in the way that I want it. I'm very specific. I'm a developer. So let's get around that. The other benefit to this is I have a lot of Git aliases that I find really helpful for working in Git and saying, hey, I want to work on my main branch, and then I have one thing that I can use to rename it, set my upstream, and push to a different feature branch that I want to use. Perfect. Or I have another one that I can use to delete all of my current branches except for the one I have to just kind of clean house and start fresh. Those are things that I miss, and I have to kind of look up how to do those every time when I don't have my aliases available to me in here. So let's take one of those and let's just say git wrap. That's a command or an alias I have. It's obviously not found here. We're going to fix that. So there is another feature in your settings called dotfiles. And dotfiles is a little misleading, so I want to tell you how I use this. The dotfiles repository, target path, and install command all work together. Really what this is it's basically saying point to some GitHub repository that you have the access to actually bring down. In my case, I'm going to show you my personal dotfiles repository that I have for this. You can do whatever you want with that. And then it's going to take that repository, install it to the target path. Very simple. And then it's going to run any command that you have available inside that target path. So I had thought at first that these dot files might replace the dot files that are available in the container. It doesn't really do that. The container comes with its own dot files, and you just need to work within that environment. So let me show you what I mean. If I cd to our home here, you can see that we have a bash rc already. And if I say code.bashrc, then we can look at what that looks like right here. And it has all of the things you would kind of expect to be there, but specifically the ones that we're going to interact with is it's looking for a .bash aliases file, which doesn't exist right now, and that's fine. We're going to leverage that by just dropping a bash aliases file in there, and then it does some other normal stuff. So we're going to do two things. We are going to make a .files repository that will add our bash aliases for us, and then we'll install omyposh and set it up with a particular configuration so I can have those nice pretty command line headers that I want. So let's take a look at the repository that I've made ahead of time here. So if we go to Gray Lovelace dotfiles, you can see it's very, very simple. We just have a bash aliases with some of those different commands I talked about. There's that gitbrat one that we want to check out and some other ones. And then we have an install script. So this install script is fairly simple. It's just going to set an environment variable with our current directory that we're going to be able to leverage. I'm basically saying, I know I'm checked out in a subdirectory, look for our home bash directory and set everything up there. And then we're going to make an alias or a symlink to our bash aliases file in that directory so it can leverage it when it starts up, and the bash RC will find a bash aliases file and register all those aliases. Then down below, and again, I don't know that this is the best way to do this, but this is the best way I've found that's kind of light touch, is I'm going to install our OhMyPosh setup. Again, this is not something I want to install on everyone's machine or everyone's dev container, so it makes sense that I'm doing this in the personal layer that we talked about. And then at the bottom, I'm just going to echo the last command we need to actually initialize this with a pointer to the config that we want, which is another repository I'll show you in a second. And I'm just going to echo that directly into the last line of our bashrc file. So that should be able to run the entire bashrc file and then run this at the bottom. And if anyone is interested in the OhMyPosh theme, there's the repo for it here as well, and we can look at it, and it's just a bunch of fun JSON blocks. So that's what it'll install. That's the config it'll reference for us. So if we go back to VS Code, we can go to our settings. We can see that I uncommented everything here, and now I'm going to rebuild again. And when I rebuild, what we should see happen is it'll bring all those down. It'll create that symlink for me. It'll install OhMyPosh and do all that stuff. And when my terminal comes up, as long as I'm using bash terminal, and the first time I do it, it might take a second here, then it should execute and turn into my OhMyPosh setup that I want. And in fact, if I go and I do a git wrap, and I say that I want to push up something, we don't have an origin, so it's not going to work super well, but I'm just going to say testing, and instead of telling me that that command doesn't exist, it's now just failing for normal reasons that I would expect. So that is kind of adding those two layers of personalization to this that I found to be really the unlocks for me and how useful dev containers can be. I haven't really found a setup that doesn't work for me anymore after applying both default extensions and my personal .files to it. I can do everything I really want, and in fact, one of the first things I do every single time I go to make either a proof of concept or I make a project that I'm going to be sharing with a lot of different people is I set up a dev container because I want to know that everyone can contribute no matter what setup that they're using, and especially if we're just between Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and all the different flavors in between. So thanks. That's been Dev Containers. I have been Gray with Technically Speaking at Source Allies. Do you have another topic you want to see covered? Great. Comment it down below and check out sourceallies.com to learn more about us. Thanks a lot.